Hello everyone. In this presentation of the endocrine system, we're going to be talking about the different types of hormones and how these hormones will function at their target cells, what they will do once they are able to bind to the receptors on the target cells. As we can see from this slide, hormones are going to be organized into 4 groups, and this is going to be based on their chemical structure. We have the amino acid derivatives, we have the peptide hormones, the steroid hormones, and the eicosanoids. And we will be talking about them in the next few slides. Let's start with the amino acid derivatives. And as the name says, they are structurally similar to amino acids, and this will make them relatively small molecules. As examples, we have derivatives of tyrosine, such as the thyroid hormone, so makes sense, tyrosine and thyroid hormones, which are going to be released by the thyroid gland, and also catecholamines, which are derivatives of tyrosine as well. And these are going to be released by the suprarenal medulla, which is located in the adrenal gland or the suprarenal gland. As examples of hormones that are released by the thyroid gland, there are 3. We have T3, T4, and calcitonin, and we will talk more about their function once we get to the thyroid gland. And examples of hormones that are released by the adrenal medulla, we have 2, which are the epinephrine and norepinephrine, which we covered already earlier, but we will go into more details when we get to the adrenal gland. The second category of amino acid derivatives are the ones that are made up of tryptophan, such as melatonin, which is going to be synthesized by the pineal gland, which is located posterior to the hypothalamus. Next, we have what we call the peptide hormones, and we all know that peptides are a combination of amino acids. Therefore, the peptide hormones are going to be a combination of amino acids to form these hormones. And as they combine, they will form these long chains of amino acids. And these hormones, they will be released by the pituitary gland. And because the pituitary gland releases several hormones, as you can see over here from this list, this will be the largest group of hormones. On this list, you don't have to know them all as of now, but we will talk about them when we get to the pituitary gland. But the first 2 are the antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. These are going to be released right over here on the posterior end of the pituitary gland, or the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and the others are going to be released on the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. And these are the thyroid stimulating hormone, the adrenocorticotropic hormone, the follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, prolactin, melanin stimulating hormone, and growth hormone. And we will talk about those in details later on. Now we're moving on to the steroid hormones. And chemically, most hormones are the amino acid based, though a few are going to be the steroids. These will be secreted by 3 of what we call steroid glands, which are the adrenal cortex, and the 2 reproductive glands, which are the testes in males and the ovaries in females. And in addition, during pregnancy, the placenta will also be responsible for the release of steroid hormones as well. Importantly, all of these steroid hormones, they're going to be derived from cholesterol, and once they are released, they will be then transported through the bloodstream, like all hormones are, to the cells of various target organs, where they will be able to carry out the regulation of a wide range of physiological functions. Now, these hormones, they're often classified according to the organs that are going to synthesize them. So, for example, the adrenal steroids, they're called this way because they will be secreted by the adrenal cortex. And the sex hormones, they're called this way because they're going to be produced by the ovaries and the testes. However, this is not a very strict rule because the adrenal cortex also secretes sex hormones, however, to a lesser extent than the sex hormones. And also, the ovaries, when they are under abnormal conditions, they may also produce adrenal steroids. So, the rule does not apply with regards to how we call these steroid hormones. However, when they are called adrenal steroids, like I said, they will mainly be produced in the adrenal cortex. And when they're called sex hormones, they will be produced in the reproductive organs. With regards to the adrenal cortex, it will produce the adrenocortical hormones, which consist of two main types, which are the glucocorticoids and the mineralocorticoids. The glucocorticoids, such as cortisol, they will control or influence many of the metabolic processes, and this will include the formation of glucose from amino acids and fatty acids, and also the deposition of glycogen in the liver. Glucocorticoids also help to maintain blood pressure, and their anti-inflammatory and immunosuppressive actions, they're going to be important when treating, for example, rheumatoid arthritis, and also preventing the rejection of transplanted organs. On the other hand, the mineralocorticoids, such as the aldosterone, they will mainly help to maintain the balance between the water and salts in the body, because they will be exerting their effects in the kidney, which is right next to the adrenal gland, so these hormones, they don't have to travel far. Let's move on to the sex hormones. The androgens, which are the male sex hormones. The most important one, or the main one, is testosterone, which is going to be produced primarily by the testes, which we can see represented here on this image. But there are going to be small amounts of testosterone that will also be produced by the adrenal cortex, and also in women in the ovaries. So women also have testosterone, but in smaller amounts. Now, androgens are primarily responsible for the development and the maintenance of the reproductive function, and they will also act on the stimulation of the secondary sex characteristics in males. What are these secondary sex characteristics? Well, these will include, for example, facial hair growth, voice deepening, things like that. And women, they have less testosterone, and that's why these secondary sex characteristics that occur in male do not occur in female. Moving on to the female sex hormones, we have estrogens, which are one of the two types of female sex hormones, and the other type will be progestin. The main hormone in the estrogen category is estradiol, and the main hormone in the progestin category is progesterone. With regards to estrogen, they're going to be secreted mainly by ovaries and in a smaller amount by the adrenal glands. And in men, we have that they are secreted by the testes. So both men and women secrete estrogen, the same way that men and women secrete testosterone. However, the amounts of these hormones are going to be very different in men compared to women. Estradiol, which is actually the most potent of the estrogens, it's going to have a similar function to testosterone in a sense that it will be the one that will promote the development of the primary and secondary female sex characteristics. What are some of these characteristics? Well, we have the enlargement of breasts and also the erection of nipples, growth of body hair, for example, especially under the arm and the pubic hair. We have widening of the hips compared to males. So there are several specific female characteristics that are all influenced by the presence of estradiol. On the other hand, progesterone is actually named for maintaining pregnancy, progestation, so progesterone. And that's the function of progesterone. It will maintain pregnancy. And it will have several other functions. So will testosterone and estradiol, but we will focus on those specific functions when we get to the reproductive system. For now, I just need you to know the ones that we talked about. Last, we have the icosanoids, which are these small molecules which have a 5-carbon ring at one end, and they're going to be released by most body cells. There are multiple subfamilies of icosanoids. These will include most prominently the prostaglandins, which you guys may be heard of, thromboxanes, leukotrienes, lipoxines, and others, but you don't really have to pay attention to the subfamilies of icosanoids. I just need you to know that the main function of these compounds are going to be to coordinate the cellular activities and also affect certain enzymatic processes, such as the ones listed here that will occur in extracellular fluids. And these examples are the induction of labor. It will also be important in the inflammatory process because it will induce swelling and also inflammation at the injury sites. It will help in the process of blood clotting and also have an important function in asthma attacks, which is not very pleasant. Since a lot of these hormones, they will influence the enzymatic processes, let's do a little overview of what enzymes are. So enzymes, they're going to help facilitate these biochemical reactions in our body, and they're going to aid in everything from breathing to digestion. And having too little or too much of a certain enzyme can lead to health problems. Some people, for example, with chronic conditions, they may need to take enzyme supplements to help their bodies work as they should normally. Now, enzymes will control all cellular activities and metabolic reactions, and hormones will influence this cellular operation by changing either the type, the activities, or the quantities of these key cytoplasmic enzymes. And in this way, a hormone will be able to regulate the metabolic operations of its target cells. What are the target cells? Well, they are going to be these peripheral cells that will respond to the presence of the hormone. And why do they respond? Well, because they will have a specific receptor for these hormones. Therefore, the hormones are circulating in the blood. They will go to a cell. If that cell has specific receptors for these specific hormones, they will bind and cause a reaction. Let's see on the next slide how the target cells will respond to the binding of the hormone. So a hormone can only trigger a reaction in specific cells. And what are these specific cells? These are what we call the target cells, which will have the right receptor for each hormone. So just like some keys can open many locks, while others only work with one, the same can be true for the hormone target cell relationship. So it can either be widespread or it can be localized. And in addition to hormone binding, the target cell activation is also going to be influenced by these 3 factors, which are the levels of the hormone that's circulating in the blood, the number of the receptors for that hormone on or inside of the target cell, and also how strong this binding is, the binding between the hormone and the receptor. So if it's really strong, then it will be a strong effect because it will stay binding longer. The target cells will also be able to regulate the amount of hormones that are going to bind to them. And this regulation is done by these 2 processes that are termed downregulation or upregulation. So if you have a lot of hormones circulating, the target cells, they can decrease the amount of receptors and therefore by decreasing the amount of receptors, the hormones will not be able to bind. So this is called downregulation. On the other hand, if you want to have more of that hormone binding to the target cells, then the target cells can increase the number of receptors, and this is called upregulation. So you're going to have more hormones binding to the target cells and causing their changes on these target cells. You can also have two or more hormones that can interact to affect the response of these target cells in a variety of ways. And the three most common types of this interaction are what we call the permissive effect, the synergistic effect, and the antagonistic effect. The permissive effect, like the name says, is going to be when you have the presence of one hormone that will enable or permit another hormone to act. For example, the thyroid hormones have a very complex permissive relationship with certain reproductive hormones. Then we have the synergistic effect, in which two hormones with similar effects produce an amplified response, so a bigger response. And in some cases, two hormones are going to be required for you to have an adequate response. So you need more hormones to be able to have a good response for your body. So for example, two different reproductive hormones, which are follicle stimulating hormone from the pituitary gland and estrogen from the ovaries, are going to be required for the maturation of the female egg. So you have two hormones acting together. The other one is what we call the antagonistic effect, in which, like the name says, you're going to have two hormones that are going to have opposing effect, so antagonistic effect. A familiar example is the effect of two pancreatic hormones. You have insulin and glucagon. So insulin will, on its hand, increase the liver storage of glucose as glycogen, decreasing blood glucose, whereas glucagon will stimulate the breakout of glycogen stores, and this will increase blood glucose. So one will act to decrease blood glucose and the other one will act to increase blood glucose. So they have opposing effects. Let's talk a little bit how this hormone receptor binding occurs. Of course, it makes a difference if the hormone is lipid soluble or water soluble, which we will see on the next slide. So if it's a lipid soluble hormone, it will be able to enter into the cell more easily. Now the receptor can be located either on the membrane, the plasma membrane, or inside of the cell. In this case, it's showing this lipid soluble hormone that will easily diffuse into the cell, passing through the cell membrane, which, as we all know, is made up of a lipid bilayer. So it makes it easier for the lipid soluble hormone to pass through this layer. It will then bind to a receptor on the cytoplasm, and then this complex, which is called the receptor hormone complex, will be able to enter into the nucleus, and once it enters into the nucleus, it will be able to cause an infect. In this case, it's going to be triggering gene transcription. So then the transcribed mRNA is going to be translated into proteins that will be able to alter the activity of this specific cell. Now in this example, we're going to have a hydrophilic or a water-soluble hormone, which is going to be unable to diffuse through the lipid bilayer of the cell membrane, and therefore it will have to pass on their message to a receptor that's going to be located at the surface of the cell. So here's your receptor, and you can see the hormone binding to this receptor. And except for the thyroid hormones, which are lipid soluble, all amino acid derived hormones will bind to cell membrane receptors that are located, at least in part, on the extracellular surface of the cell membrane. Therefore, they do not directly affect the transcription of target genes, but instead they're going to initiate what we call a signaling cascade that it will be carried out by a molecule that's called a second messenger. In this case, the hormone is going to be called the first messenger, since this process will have to occur in two different steps as the hormone is unable to enter into the cell. So the second messenger that's going to be used by most hormones is what we call the cyclic adenosine monophosphate, or CAMP. So in the CAMP second messenger system, the water-soluble hormone is going to bind to its receptor in the cell membrane. This receptor is going to be associated with what we call an intracellular component that's called the G protein, as we can see over here. And binding of the hormone will activate this G protein component. So the activated G protein in turn will activate an enzyme that's called adenylyl cyclase, which is also known as adenylate cyclase, which will convert adenosine triphosphate, which is ATP, into CAMP. As this second messenger, CAMP will activate a type of enzyme that's called protein kinase that is going to be present in the cytosol. Then this activated protein kinase initiates the phosphorylation cascade, and this basically will activate these proteins and allow them to alter the activity of the cell. This slide, we're going to talk how the endocrine activity is actually going to be controlled by these endocrine reflexes. And these endocrine reflexes, it can be triggered by three different methods. We have the humoral stimuli, then we have the hormonal stimuli, and the neurostimuli. The humoral stimuli is when you have changes in the composition of the extracellular fluid, and this will stimulate the endocrine reflex. Then we have what we call the hormonal stimuli. Hormonal just means that you're going to have the arrival or the removal of a specific hormone on that cell, and this will cause an endocrine reflex. Then we have what we call the neurostimuli, and basically neuro reminds me of neurotransmitters, and this is the arrival of neurotransmitters at a specific what we call neuroglandular junction. So a junction between a neuron and a gland. And in most cases, these endocrine reflexes, they're going to be regulated by some form of a negative feedback. And only in a few cases will you have a positive feedback mechanism. And I did add a slide about this, which is the next slide. So let's cover it in a little bit more detail. But by now, you guys should know what a positive and a negative feedback is, since we did cover this in the Anatomy and Physiology 1 class. To be able to prevent abnormal hormone levels and a potential disease state, the hormone levels, they must be tightly controlled. The body will maintain this control by balancing the hormone production and the degradation of the hormones. So feedback loops are the ones that will govern the initiation and the maintenance of most hormone secretion in response to various stimuli. So again, we have the positive feedback loop, which is going to be characterized by the release of these additional hormones. So positive, meaning that you're adding more hormones in response to an original hormone release. An example is oxytocin during labor. So you want to have more oxytocin released so that you can have more uterine contractions so the fetus can come out, and the faster it comes out, the better it is, right? So this is your positive feedback loop. So on this image, we can see that the head of the baby is what will initiate this hormone release because it will push against the cervix right over there. This will send a nerve impulse from the cervix all the way to the brain. It will stimulate the hypothalamus to secrete oxytocin into the posterior pituitary gland, and oxytocin will then circulate in the blood, and the presence of oxytocin will be the one that will cause the uterine contraction, and therefore it will push the baby towards the cervix and eventually out of the uterus. Now, most cases, you're going to have the negative feedback loop, which is basically going to be characterized by this inhibition of a further secretion of a hormone in response to these adequate levels of that hormone. Therefore, the hormone is triggered, released, it's being used up by your body, and when you don't need it any longer, then there's a mechanism that will inhibit the release of more of the same hormone. So this is called the negative feedback loop. So how do you know that you need more hormone? Well, basically, there are going to be sensors on the blood vessels that will perceive this and send an information to the hypothalamus. Once it gets to the hypothalamus, it will release, in this case, we're talking about corticotropin releasing hormone, and this hormone will then go to the adrenal glands and make sure that they release glucocorticoid. This will elevate the amount of glucocorticoid in the blood, and therefore it will sense that it doesn't need any more, because the blood vessels will send this signal to the hypothalamus to stop the release of corticotropin releasing hormone. And this is your negative feedback.